Thank you guys for all joining us for Building a Better America, a small business resource community. We'll go ahead and get started. A few housekeeping things that we like to mention. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. And the U.S. Small Business Administration does not endorse Public-Private Strategies Institute. This session is being live streamed and recorded. Please do not share any personal information in the Q&A function. And now I have the honor to introduce Senior Advisor Renee Johnson.
Hello, and welcome to Building a Better America, a small business resource community webinar series brought to you today by the U.S. Small Business Administration and Public-Private Strategies Institute. Today, we are happy to discuss community initiatives and uplift small business owners with a discussion covering resources to help your businesses thrive. We're excited to have each of you here today for this conversation. Our goal, if we can go to the next slide, today and across the series of events is to connect small businesses with critical resources and information about the Biden-Harris administration's policy agenda, including how the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the American Rescue Plan create opportunities for small businesses. Today, we'll be convening with leaders with the small business community to share pertinent information regarding the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification 2.0. Now, I have the pleasure and the distinct honor of introducing the Associate Administrator, Mark Madrid. Mr. Mark Madrid has been selected to serve as Associate Administrator for the Office of Entrepreneurial Development, also known as OED, at the U.S. Small Business Administration. In this role, Mr. Madrid has led the OED office, which is the SBA's technical assistance arm with a national resource network, including small business development centers, which are SBDCs, women's business centers, WBCs, SCORE, and the Office of Entrepreneurship Education. Mr. Madrid holds a BBA from the University of Texas at Austin McCombs School of Business and a Master of Nonprofit Administration degree from the University of Notre Dame Mendoza College of Business. And without further ado, the most amazing Mr. Madrid.
Renee, thank you, and great day to everyone, and welcome to today's Public-Private Strategies Institute and SBA webinar on cybersecurity and CMMC 2.0. And for those of you who know about CMMC and what it means, fantastic, you're in the right place. For those of you who are wondering, what does that acronym mean? You're in the right place. And I'm supercharged, as you can tell, and honored to lead SBA's Office of Entrepreneurial Development, OED. And I'm energized to be here to help kick off this great discussion about an important topic. The SBA knows that cyber hygiene is a top concern for many of our U.S. small business owners and rising entrepreneurs and those looking to start a business, especially as our small business ecosystem is booming. That's the bottom line. There were 5 million small business applications submitted in 2022, a number second only to the 10.5 million new business applications from 2021. So this administration, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and our administrator, Isabela Casillas Guzman, understand the importance of how to support our small businesses on the ground. Truly, it's a great time to be a small business owner. You are the ones that we are most thankful for. You're resilient, you're faithful, and you're hopeful. And so it is with that in mind that we're taking action on the mission given to us by our fantastic administrator here and a member of President Biden's cabinet, Administrator Isabela Casillas Guzman, the voice of over 33 million small businesses and counting. With my boss's charge, we are on a faithful mission to be customer-centric, advancing equity and technology forward. And we're also here with our regional administrator, Ekta Markulier, and our esteemed experts to share with you the importance of CMMC certification 2.0. I'm excited that this wonderful presentation you'll hear today build off and contribute to an ongoing conversation on what tools are available to small business owners like yourself to protect your businesses and your clients. Everything, by the way, will be shared. The slides will be shared, the link will be shared, and this recording will be shared. So I'm truly excited to be here in support of you. It's the highest honor imaginable to serve you, our U.S. small business owners who are ultimately resilient. And it is my honor to turn it over now to Ekta Markulier, our SBA Regional Administrator. Thank you, Ekta, for your leadership and your heart for the small business community.
Associate Administrator Madrid, thank you so much for the opportunity to work with you and be here with you today. You know, before I started as Regional Administrator as part of the Small Business Administration, I served 10 years in the Resource Partner community at the Small Business Development Center Network. And one of the most prevalent topics that came up through good times and bad times was cybersecurity. So over the 10 years, I found a great love for it. And today, really excited to bring you the topic of CMMC 2.0 with our partners. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our first speaker and presenter today, Margie Graves. Margie Graves is a senior fellow with the IBM Center for the Business of Government and the IBM Partner for Digital Transformation Strategy. She serves as a senior advisor to IBM's Federal Services Practice and is a member of IBM's former Government Executives Council. Her work with the center and with IBM Federal Accounts is informed by her track record of experience and expertise in both the government and private sectors. She is the former Federal Deputy Chief Information Officer. In the federal-wide program, she worked to improve the way the government delivers results and technology services to the public. She led the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer efforts to drive value in federal IT, deliver digital services, protect federal IT assets and information through cybersecurity, and develop the next generation IT workforce. She also drove elements of the President's management agenda, IT modernization, data as a strategic asset, and workforce of the 21st century. Margie, we're so excited to have you today. Please take the stage.
Thank you so much, Ekta, and I really am happy to be here to speak with your audience today on this very important topic. I wanted to highlight the fact that one of our goals today with this seminar is to make sure that you walk away with the confidence that you have gained information and resources that will help you in your implementation of CMMC. But I'd like to start today with a little bit of an overview of the program itself. If we could move to the first slide. Thank you. A little bit of the history of CMMC, why it came into being, what the genesis of it was, and how it's evolved over time. So there was a recognition within the Department of Defense that even though they were exemplary at protecting national defense information at the top secret and TSSCI level, there was also information at the CUI level that was sensitive and needed to have its own protection mechanism. If you look at that second bullet, it was recognition that they needed to develop a consistent, comprehensive framework to enhance cybersecurity for the United States Defense Industrial Base. And the reason why they need to do that and protect this information is to make sure that we understand that all businesses that serve in that defense industrial base are part of a conglomerate of ecosystems, and we are an extension in small business of their actual delivery of mission. And every part of that ecosystem has to meet the same standards and requirements. Those requirements are laid out in section 1648 of the National Defense Authorization Act of FY 2020. The fiscal year 2020 was fall of 2019. That's when this came into being. The framework itself is laid out in terms of the CMMC 1.0, which after that act was passed, the Department of Defense was charged with going forward and developing the actual structure of the CMMC, and to also go through the rulemaking process, which allowed the public to comment on the structure itself as it was being developed, and also raise some of the concerns and implementation challenges as it was being developed. That rulemaking process resulted in a clause in the DFARS, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, that the Department of Defense uses to run their contracts, and the contractor compliance with the cybersecurity maturity model at certification level is required in that section. So you can look that up and you can read that section. It gives you that requirement. But what I wanted to emphasize today is that the NIST risk management framework is foundational to the CMMC. It's not like we tossed the baby out with the bathwater. We're still tying back to the NIST 800 series. And those of you that are familiar with the NIST risk management framework know that it's an implementation guideline that tells you kind of where to start and how to move forward. That is still relevant, and it is not a waste of time to have learned how to do that. In fact, you can use this risk management framework in order to implement CMMC. And on the right-hand side, you see what the intent was. Of course, we want to safeguard sensitive information, but we also want to become, as small businesses, the partners that dynamically enhance the defense industrial base. And what that means is that you are held to that standard. You are part of the delivery of the mission, and there is no difference between where they leave off and you start. It's all part of the delivery of the mission. So the expectation of the public is that you will protect and defend that information in the same way that DoD does. And to ensure that, there are accountability mechanisms that allow us to comply with those DoD requirements, particularly within the framework. There are points at which they ask you to either self-assess or obtain a third-party assessment that lets you validate that you are operating effectively within the structure. And finally, I want to emphasize that all of this contributes toward that partnership that I was talking about. And together we maintain the public trust. If we can move to the next slide. CMMC 1.0 evolved into CMMC 2.0, and it was a simplification of the original model. There were too many levels and some confusion as to when the touch points were in terms of the verification requirements. And so with feedback from the community that was trying to implement the model, the DoD set forth to change it into 3 levels only. So it's now foundational, advanced, and expert, and it's more clear as to when the actual verification would have to be done and in what manner. If we can move to the next slide. So what does this mean for you in its entirety? Implementing the CMMC for your business is something that will increase your opportunity, and getting it right will reduce your business risk. Those risks include legal risk, operational risk, and risk to reputation. If you want to operate in this environment and become that effective partner, you need to make sure that you're in compliance with all the legal requirements. And also, it's very important that you work with your contracting officers and your clients to understand the liability clauses and the damage ceilings that are within your contracts, so that it's very clear from the outset what the responsibilities are and that you don't get yourself into trouble in that regard. That's why contractual language is so important, and I'm sure we'll discuss that further as we move through the discussion. The operational risk, of course, as you're operating, once you've got a contract in hand and as you're operating, you will need to consistently validate and prove that you're actually meeting the requirements over time. And that's where audits and third-party assessments come in. And they're there to keep you honest and to ensure the federal government that you're continuously watching and upgrading your cybersecurity posture so that it is in compliance with the framework going forward. And in terms of risk to reputation, it's not only risk to your reputation, but risk to the reputation of your government client. Nobody wants to end up on the front page of the Washington Post. The risk to the reputation is the inability to meet those standards or to actually have an incident and be unable to mitigate it. Those are things that we want to guard against. And by implementing the CMMC as it's intended, we will be able to avoid that risk. We can move to the next slide, please. So your action guide is really to certify to the appropriate level. And what I mean by that is there are varying levels of data and the protection there too that you have to be aware of. So within your contract or the actual mission work that you're doing for the DoD, what is the level of protection of the data that's going to be resident in your systems and it's going to be exchanged with the DoD? In order to do that, you have to be aware of the types of data that are being used in that mission process. And you don't want to oversubscribe or undersubscribe. You want to get it just right in the middle. In order to do that, we need to understand the level of compliance necessary for the types of contracts your company wants to pursue and match your adoption to that level of risk. And you can always push back, ask questions of your contracting officer. If the contracting officer has a certain level of protection required in the contract, if you feel that that is oversubscribed, you can actually have that conversation. Do not be afraid to do that. That is the negotiation process, and it's a very important part of it so that we make sure that we're not forcing businesses into a more expensive implementation that they would normally have to do. So join organizations also that are discussing the best practices for how you would actually implement, because there are many companies that have been there and done that and are further along on the journey than you are. And if you are far along on the journey, please be a mentor to those that need assistance. So continue that open dialogue, be a part of that community, discuss the best practices, and ultimately you will have success. If we can move to the last slide, please. I just wanted to leave you with this thought, and it's actually where I began the conversation, is it's important to be that partner that understands that cybersecurity is a team sport and you're only as good as your weakest link. Therefore, all players in that ecosystem have to demonstrate cyber resilience. And that's the ability to not only protect data, but if there ever is an incident, to be able to deter attacks, to respond to attacks, and to recover from attacks. That's the expectation that DoD has of the businesses in the defense industrial base. And hopefully when you leave today, you will be provided with the resources for you to be able to comply. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Eka.
Margie, thank you so much for your expertise today and introduction to our CMMC discussion. Next up, I would like to introduce Dr. Sean Murray. Sean Murray is the President, Senior Consultant, and Chief Academic Officer at Murray Security Services. He's an experienced cybersecurity professional and is an officer in the U.S. Civil Air Patrol. His previous assignments include work with the United States Missile Defense Agency, U.S. Army Cyber Command in Europe, U.S. Air Force, and with commercial industry in various roles in information assurance and cybersecurity. He has traveled the globe performing physical and cybersecurity assessments on critical national defense and coalition programs and has prepared reports for the House Armed Services Committee. Dr. Murray was reelected to the International Board of Directors, most recently as a COO for the Information Systems Security Association, or ISSA. He is a professional member of many acronymed organizations, IEEE, ACM, ISSA, IESC squared, and is an FBI InfraGard program partner. He enjoys spending time traveling with his family, researching and collaborating with other professionals in cybersecurity and cyber law, and plays soccer in a local league in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Sean, thank you so much for being here with us today. We are looking forward to learning more about CMMC and the details of what has come to small businesses. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ekta, and thank you, Margie, for a great overview of the historical significance from the government's perspective, right? So now we're going to look at some of the intricacies associated with some of the challenges and answer hopefully some of the questions that many of you may have, no matter where you are in your journey with CMMC integration or implementation. So without further ado, go to the next slide, please. All right, so Margie actually gave a really good overview of the CMMC program. I'm not going to read through this entire slide. You'll actually have access to all of the material, all of the slides to include these. But referring back to Margie's overview of the program, the idea is for the federal government to help control the supply chain. We as small businesses are subs to primes that have large contracts. Some of us may be in a contract situation where we're an 8A or a small business set aside, where we may have responsibilities protecting sensitive information as part of the supply chain. And we may be a subcontract to a subcontractor. The idea is to determine what sensitive information that we may process, transmit, or store on behalf of our obligations to the contract that we fulfill on behalf of the government. And the government will help us identify where those areas are. And then based on the framework, CMMC 2.0, help us determine what the cyber hygiene is related to protecting that sensitive information and identifying those key assets where we process, transmit, and store information. So the framework does have 3 key features: the tiered model, the assessment requirement, and the implementation through the contracts, as Margie had given an overview. Next slide, please. So evolution to CMMC 2.0. Margie indicated that there were some rulemakings that came through the Federal Acquisition Regulation and that came over into the Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. So some rulemakings came in stating there was a mandatory compliance requirements with a level of rigor that concerned a lot of small businesses and large businesses. And some of that rigor came down to how expensive is this going to be? What does the control framework look like? There was a hodgepodge of various industry-specific controls digest to include NIST, as Margie had mentioned, and ISO 27002, other CIS controls, and it got to be pretty complicated and in some instances confusing for those that were going to have to move forward to try and implement, and those who wanted to go after government contracts who had never done this before in the defense industrial base. How are they going to be able to comply? What level of money were they going to have to invest in their business without necessarily getting guaranteed a contract? So the evolution to CMMC 2.0 addressed a lot of these concerns. We'll be able to share some resources at the end of this presentation to demonstrate a lot of free resources and resources that are available to the community in order to be able to understand the requirements and then move forward in doing self-assessments in preparation for the rulemaking and the mandatory assessment at the 3 levels that Margie had indicated earlier. So again, not going through all of the information on the slide, you'll get access to it later. But in November of 2021, CMMC 2.0, based on the feedback that small businesses and constituents brought back to their congressional leaders, addressed a lot of these areas. Again, the idea is to protect, identify and protect the sensitive information and identify the assets where that information may be processed, transmitted, or stored. Next slide, please. So as our Margie had shown you, there are 2 different architectures here. The first framework focused on that level of rigor that became very confusing and in some instances just weren't reasonable to some small business. CMMC 2.0, which is the new framework, allows for a better identification of what you may be processing, transmitting, and storing, and the ability, if it's a low level, to do a self-assessment and demonstrate back to the government what you're doing to demonstrate a specific hygiene under 17 different practices. Level 2 may allow, depending on the government's insight as to what you may be required to do. You may be able to do a self-assessment, or you may have a requirement for a disinterested third party to come in and assess your environment based on the NIST Special Pub 800-171. This is how we handle controlled unclassified information with 110 different practices. If it's determined that it's a higher level of sensitivity, CUI comes down to two different labels for controlled unclassified information, CUI basic and CUI specific. The government is required to come in and explain through the contracting office and to you in the solicitation process what that information is that needs to be protected in accordance with 171. So you may be required to have a third-party assessment, or you may be able to do a self-assessment at level 2. It'll be determined in your contract. Level 3 is definitely going to be an assessment. So you're talking about higher levels of sensitivity of information, trained government-led assessments that actually demonstrates a cyber hygiene over a period of time that will be reassessed once every 3 years, or depending on the level of sensitivity, additional time frame with follow-up assessments to address deficiencies in some instances. Next slide, please. All right, so with the implementation of CMMC 2.0, the Defense Department is introducing several key changes that build on and refine the original program. So the streamlined model, removing the rigor of a 5-tier to a 3-tiered model, will give you the ability to better understand which factor you might be aligned with, 1, 2, or 3, and then allows that alignment with widely accepted standards using NIST as the primary baseline. We're not using ISO 27000 series and CIS controls and NIST. We're focusing on NIST as the framework to provide the assessment controls and what you need to be able to meet. Reliable assessments, reduced assessment costs. This was one of the big issues that were of great concern to many small businesses. Now it allows compliant at level 1, foundational with self-assessment. However, you're going to have to demonstrate that, maybe submit documentation, contract, vendor agreements to be able to demonstrate through your self-assessment that you're compliant with the cyber hygiene and information protection requirements. This will be required to demonstrate compliance through your self-assessments. So higher accountability increases oversight for professional and ethical standards for third-party assessors as well. So the idea is a third-party assessor coming in needs to have the credentials or the experience necessary to demonstrate to the government they understand what your criteria is or what your cyber hygiene is supposed to look like. And then flexible implementation. Again, going back to the concerns from the small business community, spirit of collaboration, which allows companies under certain limited circumstances to make plans of actions and milestones, otherwise referred to as a POAM, to achieve certification. In the previous model of CMMC 1.0, there were no POAMs allowed, which is kind of not reasonable. I've been doing certification accreditation for the government for many years at all kinds of classifications. And if you're not able to meet some of the requirements, that's the purpose of the POAM, is to document as though it was a risk register, those things that you're not compliant with. Maybe you need more time or you need to set aside some budget to be able to address those deficiencies in your environment. In CMMC 2.0, we are now allowed to create a POAM and still achieve certification while we work to comply with those things that we might be deficient with. This provides an added flexibility and speed, allows waivers on CMMC requirements that are approved by the government under certain limited circumstances. Next slide. So rulemaking. So Margie had explained the DFAR rulemaking process, and these were mandatory under CMMC 1.0 in your contract. So if you were awarded a contract previously, before they put a hiatus on CMMC 1.0, you were actually required to demonstrate and meet these requirements in order to be awarded a contract or to renew your contract after the initial performance period. So now there has been a pause on the rulemaking while the Department of Defense and the Cyber AB work together to define what the new rulemaking rules are going to be. So we may see these come back. We may see them redefined. The idea is they're on pause right now. There is no mandatory requirement at this point in time until the rulemaking comes back. Now, so while the rulemaking efforts are ongoing, the department intends to suspend those CMMC piloting efforts that they had initiated under 1.0. And then the department encourages contractors to continue to enhance their cybersecurity posture during the interim period while rulemaking is underway. This is absolutely necessary. It's not, no organization or company should be waiting to the last minute to see what the requirements are. You would think that you would want to protect those things that are sensitive to your business anyway. The cyber hygiene that you initiate now is protecting the things that you're doing now. So the department has developed a resource for small businesses, medium and large businesses called Project Spectrum. And we're going to look at some slides with some resources, some screenshots where I've logged into my account, where I can show you the resources that address a lot of the concerns and questions that small businesses had under the CMMC 1.0. This will help the defense industrial based companies, small businesses that want to participate, assess their cyber readiness and begin adopting sound cybersecurity practices to demonstrate a specific cyber hygiene. So the Department of Defense is exploring opportunities to provide incentives for contractors who voluntarily obtain CMMC certification in the interim period. So additional information is provided by the Cyber AB and the Department of Defense Defense Secretary CIO's office. Next slide, please. All right, so now that we have CMMC 2.0, will companies be required to comply with CMMC 1.0? So as I mentioned, the rulemaking has, they've placed a pause on the DFAR rules. And once CMMC 2.0 is codified through the rulemaking, that expectation is sometime later this year, the department will require companies to adhere to the revised CMMC framework, the 3 levels, according to requirements set forth in the regulation. Next slide, please. So one of the other questions that we get commonly, when will CMMC 2.0 be required for DoD contracts? As I stated in the previous slide and was mentioned by Margie, the publication of the materials related to CMMC 2.0 reflect the department's strategic intent with respect to the CMMC program. But CMMC 2.0 will not be a contractual requirement until the department completes the rulemaking, which is expected later this year. They put down the 9 to 24 months. We know, the challenges we have in government getting things through, but we're expecting probably later this year, we should be expected to move into the CMMC 2.0 framework. Next slide. All right, why did they make the changes? Well, I mentioned throughout the presentation earlier, there were a lot of concerns from the small business community. Those were voiced up to our legislators at the state and federal level, and there were inquiries from legislators back into the Secretary of Defense to address those concerns. There were 850 public comments in response to the interim rule, and so we've modified, meaning the government has modified their approach on earlier, they've been addressed. So comments focus on the need to enhance CMMC by reducing costs for the small business, increasing trust, and then clarifying and aligning the cybersecurity requirements. CMMC 2.0 addresses a lot of the concerns from the small business community. Next slide, please. How much will it cost? Well, there's no real way to determine what that is. It depends on your contract. Depends on what level that you need to adhere to. But remember, there's a lot of now free resources that allows organizations to begin to move forward to achieve a level of compliance. You shouldn't be waiting to the end and then trying to put together a big budget to try and comply. You should be moving forward things like antivirus, looking at multi-factor authentication for privileged user accounts, doing internal assessments on your organization now, looking at relationships with your vendors. These are all things you should be doing now and preparing for that. Go ahead to the next slide, please. All right, so the next ones are just some of the resources. We're going to fly through these. So this is the Office of the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Department of Defense. Head out to their site. You can get additional information on their approach and their strategy. 5 steps of cybersecurity, some high-level strategy that allows you to understand what the approach is and how to achieve it. Next slide. All right, so the one key thing you need to know that if you are if it's a required that you need meet a level 3 requirement, it is the federal government, the Department of Defense, will be doing the assessment on your organization, not a third party. So the department intends for level 3 cybersecurity requirements to be assessed by government officials. Assessment requirements are currently under development for that level of rigor. That's the highest level out of 1, 2, or 3. Under CMMC 2.0, Margie had mentioned what these requirements are. So self-assessment for level 1 could be a self-assessment or a third-party assessment at level 2. Next slide. Project Spectrum. So this is something that has been provided by the Secretary of Defense and the Cyber AB as a resource for small businesses. So comprehensive, cost-effective platform provides companies, institutions, organizations with cybersecurity information, resources, tools, training. The mission is to improve the cyber readiness of all those who want to participate. And it's geared specifically for small businesses because this addresses one of the big concerns. Next slide. So these are the various offerings. So cyber readiness checks, a dashboard allows you to do your self-assessments and record the results, allows you to do workforce development training for various roles, your IT people, your regular users, those who are actually doing the work. Next slide. All right, so this is logged into my Project Spectrum account. So you can see a dashboard. I can manipulate different things. Next slide. All right, so looking at one of the drop downs, you can see cyber readiness check training, useful tools, links, resources. These are all available once you create your account, and it costs nothing to create your account. Next slide. All right, so I chose cyber readiness check. What does that mean? Well, click on the link that says cyber readiness check. Next slide. It comes up with a dashboard that allows me to assess my compliance with a specific level under CMMC 2.0. Next slide. I register, sign up for my free Project Spectrum account. Next slide. And then you can see what the various levels are, and I can actually record what I'm compliant with and record my progress. Next slide. Here you can see the very specific controls associated with, in this instance, level 2, NIST 800-171 for CUI. Next slide. Online courses reaches out to another resource within Project Spectrum. Next slide. CUI for contractors, CMMC level 1 course, various courses and videos that you can take to familiarize yourself with the intent of what the program are in various areas. Next slide. And here is the login to the video and the courseware. Next slide. Here's an example of me trying to understand what the regulatory environment is for CMMC, and there provides an interactive learning session so that I can answer a lot of those questions that I may not understand. Next slide. Various products and resources, useful tools that are in the Project Spectrum as well. Next slide. Resources out to other federal agencies to help in the journey. Next slide. And with that, I really appreciate everyone's attention. I hope I was able to provide some useful information to address a lot of the concerns that have been vocalized over the last couple of years, transitioning from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0. I'll hand it back over to Ekta Markwillier. Thank you, Ekta.
Dr. Murray, thank you so much for your time today. There's a lot of questions that we have coming in, and I just want to remind everyone that a lot of those questions were answered in Dr. Murray's slides, and you will receive a copy of his presentation along with this recording afterwards, so you can refer back to that. Next up, and very exciting for me to introduce, is Rick Schmidt, President and CEO of Tipping Point Solutions. I think it's very important that you hear from another small business owner, and that's why we've added Rick to the panel, because he's going to talk about his journey and the growth of his business and when cyber became important. So Rick, really quick, I'd love to give everyone a quick bio about you, so hang on tight. Rick Schmidt is the 2019 Colorado Small Business Person of the Year. He has built a distinguished career as a creative visionary and highly successful business operator. As president and CEO of Tipping Point Solutions, a veteran and Native American-owned firm, Rick oversees the day-to-day instructional design, media production, and courseware and technology development efforts that support the company's service offerings. With over 30 years of management experience supporting both the military and commercial markets, Rick is a recognized expert in blending film media and interactive training technologies. He'll also tell you a little bit about his cyber expertise that he's gained throughout his time in the military. Rick is a member of the Salt Tribe of Chippewa Indians in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and TPS currently serves as an SBA-approved mentor-protege relationship with Chippewa Government Solutions, LLC, where TPS, or Tipping Point Solutions, provides mentorship and support to facilitate CGS's success and growth. We're so excited to have you here, Rick. Thank you so much. Please tell us about, your journey with Tipping Point Solutions, your growth. Give us a little bit of narrative of what it's actually like as a small business thinking about CMMC and starting to implement it as well.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ekta. I appreciate it. And thank you for Margie and Dr. Murray's really good overview of CMMC. I learned some things on this call that I didn't otherwise know. So I think the first thing I'll tell you is, regardless of what background you come in from as a business owner, there's always some evolution in terms of understanding anything, whether it's your DCAA compliance with accounting practices to support the FAR requirements of contracts, which scare a lot of business owners, to now CMMC. It's going to be a bit of a learning curve. So I want to talk a little bit about our experience. As Ekta mentioned briefly, I came from a military background and a career as a Navy information warfare officer and retired from service after 20 years. Half of those years, I served the National Security Agency on missions to support cybersecurity. So I have a little bit of an advantage of coming into the business world with an appreciation of cyber defense and the importance of cybersecurity. I'll put a caveat out that that's been a long time in the past. My CISSP certifications have long since expired, and I no longer consider myself a cyber expert by any stretch of the imagination. But I want to start off by saying that I've always recognized the vulnerabilities of businesses when it comes to cybersecurity. So when the Obama administration, came out in 2010 and it's instituted the NIST 800-171, people like me in the business community were getting whispers of this new thing that was forthcoming and how the government was putting a deeper emphasis on protecting CUI. At the time, they didn't refer to it as that. And what I felt at that time is I was like most small businesses in America, just wanting to make it to year 5 and be a statistic that wasn't a 50% of companies that fail in the first 5 years. And my priorities were focused on making payroll, dealing with evolving accounting practices so that on the cost plus fixed fee contracts, when DCA came knocking on my door for an accounting audit, which for most of us out there is a scary proposition, that everything was dialed in. So there was a hierarchy of needs for small business. The idea of NIST, and then what came about in 2020 is the CMMC certification program, just continued to sort of put a deeper emphasis on the importance of that. So what I'd like to say up front is, despite my background, I still didn't have everything right, nor even today do I feel like I have 100% of it right. So for those on the call right now that are at an earlier stage of your company's development, and you're a 5-person company, you're not resourced with a full-time IT staff, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate what would be tantamount to trying to get into tax code and managing your own tax accounting. Most of us hire CPAs to do that because it's well beyond our expertise. And I think for us in early 2020, we realized that while we had done the basic things to try to lock down our security practices and be smart about security, we weren't probably where we needed to be on the path towards compliance on the CMMC program, the 1.0 at that time. And we elected to hire a company that we could work with, because at that time, you know, we were a relatively still small company and didn't have a bench of people on our team that had the expertise in-house. So we sought that team's expertise out of house, and we consulted with the company. And you know, 1.0 turned into 2.0. And I think for a lot of business owners out there, and I speak to the government side of the house for those listening on the government side, is we felt in some ways of, are we chasing a moving target? Are the goalposts for CMMC compliance continually being reset? And is now the right time for us to incur the large expense as a small business to comply with the standards at the time that now have evolved to 2.0 and have evolved, or do we wait? Because, you know, when you're trying to compete against the large businesses out there as a small business, and you add the additional cost of management of a CMMC program, and yet, you know, the requirement's still not mandated, even though the 800-171 has always been a self-certification, you know, requirement. But with the additional stress of future contracts and DFARS requiring that you could be subject to an audit, or there are fiduciary responsibilities should anything happen to your company that leaks information out, that you need to be cognizant of that. So I know that we're wrapping close to the time limit. I could talk about this for a long time. I will say that the additional component of my efforts is I am a staunch supporter of SBA and small business programs. Us being a mentor for another small startup company with Chippewa Government Solutions as a mentor puts us back in a position of understanding how does one who starts a company in a very vulnerable period when you're a 1-person or 2-person operation, but then have to inherit immediately all of these requirements that are the same requirements that a large company like a Raytheon or a Northrop Grumman are doing similarly. And yet you as a small business have the same requirements to be a subcontractor to walk that line and comply with those same requirements. It's rather daunting. So I will applaud a lot of what Dr. Murray presented there with some of the projects or programs that are coming out, because they didn't exist in 2020 when we embarked on our CMMC journey. And only recently have we seen a lot of things start to become available to small businesses. One I'll mention, and then I'll sign off and let the Q&A begin, is the NSA's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center offerings. There's the protective DNS services, there's website vulnerability scanning, there's threat intelligence, and there's 2 other services that are, I think, in the pipeline to be forthcoming to support, you know, phishing email protections and threat hunting. So all these things, to not get too technical, are resources that for companies like us, they're free services. And they're things that you can subscribe into that will allow you to start checking through your SPURS scores, or the scores that you have basically to get the 110 items you'll be required to do for level 2. And you can check a lot of those blocks off by being able to implement what's already out there and what wasn't out there a year ago. So I think as you kind of look around and look at the slide presentation that Dr. Murray presented and tap into some of those resources, there's a lot more out there than there once was. And I think there's a bit of information that might be spread around that is probably not completely accurate. So with that, Ekta, I think I'll turn it back over to you all and let you embark on some Q&As based on some of the participants. Thank you.
Rick, thank you so much. The small business is so valuable, because I think it's important everyone knows that it is sometimes a struggle to become cyber compliant. and your honesty and remarks are so greatly appreciated. Margie and Sean, if you can please join us again on screen, I would greatly appreciate it. We have about 4 minutes before we turn it back to our host. There's a couple of questions that came up that are common questions that I think are important to tackle from the Q&A. The first one, Margie, I'm going to go to you first. There's a basic question that I keep seeing here is like, what data, and I know Sean, you went over this, but you can't hear it enough, but Margie, what data actually needs to be protected?
Well, there are different levels, and I'll ask Dr. Sean Murray to bring in his perspective too. But there are different levels that are required, and it depends upon the type of data that you're exchanging and using within your systems. There are lower levels that are considered like PII that are important but are not national security risk. And then there are higher levels. And I saw a question in the chat too about does this bleed over into secret and top secret? And the answer is no. This is particularly set out for controlled unclassified information because there was the recognition that that information was being freely shared and not protected at the level at which the DoD required. So I think it's dependent upon your contract and the type of data that you're actually utilizing. The second level is more along the lines of when you talk about the actual programs and the programmatics of some of the systems within DoD. That next level requires the expectation of a certification that is at a higher level. And so you're moving up the chain, but and I know Dr. Murray, you had talked earlier about how you self-identify where that would be. And our biggest concern is that we don't over classify some of this data requirement, and that the conversations occur between you and the contracting officer and the client at the time, because we have a danger of swinging that pendulum too far to the right and requiring certain levels of protection that are really not necessary depending on the level of the data that's being used. So that's really where we have to make sure that we're vigilant.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Margie's comment quickly, just to say from an industry standpoint, we're already seeing evidence of where contracts are coming out with CUI requirements, and nobody can really describe at the government level as to what part of it is CUI within that, and is there a reason that some of that stuff would be classified as CUI. So, coming from the government side where I dealt with top secret and secret level content, the classification being properly conducted is going to be important. I think Dr. Murray talked about this in his presentation of, go back during your negotiation process and question the contracting office about, whether or not that's appropriate or not, rather than incur additional costs to build an enclave within your organization to support the need to have people operate in a CMMC environment. So I hope the government, puts some parameters in place to make sure that people aren't just doing it for safety reasons and putting CUI on stuff just to be careful.
Sean Murray, Dr. Murray, if you'd like to close out in the next 60 seconds with some final comments on that.
Yeah, so no, Margie hit it on the head, and Rick, emulating what Rick had said as well. And we've experienced these over the years, even with specific contracts dealing with classified information. The government has an obligation to tell you what that is. And some of the challenges we have on the government side is we need to better educate sometimes our contracting officers so that they understand what those requirements are. So the contracting officer may be that person who is the go-between of the data owner. The data owner needs to tell you what needs to be protected and at what level. And that's the government. That's an obligation from the government. So be polite, but be firm. Make sure that whatever your obligations are that they're writing into the contract, they're not overclassifying. We've seen primes making subs agree to a level of rigor that is just unreasonable. One of the examples that we talked about just last week, there is a gentleman who works for a Prime using the Prime's laptop, accessing the Prime's network, and they're a sole consultant. They don't have any of their own systems or applications that access any sensitive information, but yet they're being told they have to comply with CMMI or CMMC 2.0 level 2. That's not reasonable. So those are the questions we need to ask.
Dr. Murray, Margie Graves, Rick Schmidt, thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been a very fast, overwhelming at times, set of information, but very much needed for our small business community. I want to remind everyone that there was a great set of resources in Dr. Murray's presentation. Please take a look at those when you receive your copy of the slides and link to the presentation. As a reminder, you will get all of that. Great resources there. And one more I'd love to plug is the America Small Business Development Centers, our boots on the ground, helping small businesses every day with their needs for security. They have a program called North, and they have cyber experts throughout the entire country helping small businesses, and you can utilize their resources for free. So please check them out. americassbdc.org is that website where you can drill down to what they have. So thank you for being here today. Thank you to Public-Private Strategies. Renee, I'm going to hand this back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers today. So much information that we were given. And so like you've heard, I know there are so many questions here, so much energy in the Q&A. Many of those will be addressed in the slide deck that you will receive in the email tomorrow. So look forward to that. And if you have not, registered for this webinar, feel free to email us and go ahead and do so there. Our next webinar will be Thursday, February 9th at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can RSVP at ppsi.org. There'll be a link available starting tomorrow so that you'll be able to register for that webinar. And again, if you have any SBA related questions, go to the answer desk at sba.gov. And if you have any questions about a copy, like I was mentioning earlier, of this webinar, please feel free to contact us at events@publicprivatestrategies.com. And with that, we bid you adieu. Have a great week, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Have a great weekend.